Hey everybody, Pastor Steve here. Today for our devotion, we are in the 12th chapter of John's Gospel. As always, please, I hope you've already read this chapter and written in your journal what God showed you. Remember, we use the HEAR method. H for highlight, what passage, what verse, what word, what theme stood out to you. E, explain, what does it mean? In the original text, to the original audience, what is God saying? What is He teaching there? A, application. How does it apply to life? How does it apply to us? And then R, how are we going to respond? What are we going to pray? What are we going to do? Change as a result of what God shows us in His Word. All right, today, chapter 12. After reading this chapter, what I wrote at the top of my journal is this: first impressions can be misleading, and judging someone on the basis of one experience can be inaccurate. And the example in this chapter is Martha. You remember Martha is the sister of Mary and their brother Lazarus. And yesterday in chapter 11, it was Lazarus, their brother, Martha's brother, who was raised from the dead. Well, Jesus is back in Bethany. Their time has passed between chapters 11 and 12. And in the first 3 verses of chapter 12, look at it with me, please. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And we read about that in the previous chapter. And so they made a supper. They made him a supper there. So they prepared a meal for Jesus. And Martha was serving. Okay, she's waiting on tables, she's fixing food, all of that. But Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him, with Jesus. Verse 3, and Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard, expensive perfume, and she anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So Lazarus is sitting at the table listening to Jesus teach. Mary anoints Jesus' feet for burial, if you will. Martha's making preparations, serving the tables. She's busy. She's working, and this may cause you to recall another story about these sisters found in Luke. Chapter 10, the latter part of Luke chapter 10, that took place earlier in Jesus' ministry, when Jesus is at their house, and again, Martha is distracted and busy making preparations for the meal, and Mary is sitting there listening to Jesus teach. And you'll remember Martha asked Jesus to tell Mary to help her, and Jesus says, no, she's chosen the better thing, and Martha, you're distracted. And so we read that story, and then this one in John chapter 12, and if we're not careful, we get this image, excuse me, of Mary being much more spiritual than Martha. That Martha didn't make time for Jesus, didn't make time for the spiritual things, for the important things. And I get that. That's our impression based on these 2 stories, especially the one in Luke. But I think we missed some things. Back in Luke, that first story when Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet and Martha's making preparations, we read over it, but one of the things it says there is that Martha was the one who had invited Jesus to come into their house in the first place. It wasn't Mary, it was Martha. And yesterday, chapter 11, which you read, and I didn't talk about this in my devotion because I talked about the reactions people had to Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But in the story in chapter 11, when Lazarus dies and the sisters send word to Jesus, and he finally makes his way to Bethany where they lived, and Lazarus had already been dead 4 days. And the sisters, Martha and Mary, were in the house weeping. There were family and neighbors and so on there grieving with them, and word comes into the house that Jesus is outside. And what you may have missed in John chapter 11 is that Martha was the one who got up and went outside to see Jesus. Mary stayed in the house. And Martha and Jesus have this conversation while Mary is in the house greeting. And in verses 25 and following, Jesus said to Martha, this is John chapter 11, the previous day's chapter, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then he looks at Martha and he says, do you believe this? And Martha's response in verse 27 is, yes, Lord, I have believed. Notice this. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Martha knew who Jesus was. She knew that he was the Christ. In the Greek, that's Christos, the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word for Messiah. Christos, the anointed one, that Jesus was the one that had been promised, the Messiah, the Christ. She knew that, and she believed. And she's the one that went back into the house and gets Mary to come out and talk to Jesus before Lazarus is raised from the dead. And my point is simple. Yes, in the two stories, John chapter 12 and Luke chapter 10, Martha is busy serving. And in Luke 10, even distracted by it. But that doesn't mean she wasn't spiritual. And she didn't love Jesus. Because the story in John chapter 11 we read yesterday, she was the one who first got up to meet Jesus. She was the one who knew who Jesus was. So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to judge Martha. Maybe there was more to her than meets the eye. A first impression can be wrong, can be incomplete. Judging someone on the basis of one or two experiences may be true, may not be true. Be careful. Be careful. That's the message for today. And one more thing to point out. See, if somebody did what a lot of Christians do, they just sit down and open the Bible. What am I going to read today? They might read one of these stories and get some really good truth and takeaways. But what jumped out at me because I was reading chapter 10 of John, then chapter 11 of John, and then chapter 12 of John, reading the Bible sequentially. When I did, the contrast between chapters 11 and 12, between what Martha did in 11 and what Martha did in 12, what Mary did in 11, what Mary did in 12, really jumped out at me. And then I remembered the other story and went and looked it up in Luke 10. There are things we see in God's Word when we read it systematically that we just never see. When we just open, where am I going to read today? Oh, there's a verse I like. No, that's not the way. That's not the better way. Let me say it that way. That's not the better way. The better way is to sequentially read God's Word, because you will begin to see things you will never see otherwise. And that is a word to the wise. I'll see you tomorrow.